to our 2017 FreeUK Genealogy meeting on community benefits. It's lovely to see you all here. It's great that we've got so many of our volunteers and members of the genealogy community. So thank you very much. I'm just going to tell you some housekeeping things before I pass on to Pat to give the proper welcome and introduction. There are no fire drills planned this afternoon, so if the alarm should sound, don't panic, please. Don't use the lift. Just exit down via the staircase through the main entrance, turn right, and there is a meeting point outside St Mary's Church, not very far away, but far enough away to not be in danger. Also, there's a toilet downstairs. You've probably found it by now. If you go down the staircase, and it is in a little corridor to the left-hand side. Any problems? If anybody needs any help, if you do need to leave the building for any reason, just let me know and I will arrange that for you. Okay. Right, thank you. And it's Pat. I can't see it, please. Our YouTube channel is showing Community Benefits Part 1 right now, yes.
Thank you. Some of you may have been with us 18 months ago when we had huge technical difficulties and decided to come in person this time instead. And others of you are joining us now via a live YouTube feed, which we're hoping is working. I'm using a microphone so that I hope you can all hear me within the room, and also that I come out clearly when you're listening to us on YouTube. As well as YouTube, we've got a backup camera running, which we hope will mean that even if YouTube goes down, we will still have a decent film to show you at a later date. Can I ask you all to turn your phones to silence, or what is sometimes called politeness mode, please? Thank you. We're going to change the running order slightly. This is the point where I stop being able to see you and I can see my text instead. I thought that was probably the important way around with this. I would like to start today's meeting by thanking all those who've contributed to FreeUK Genealogy, including our 3 current projects, FreeBMD, FreeSen and FreeReg, over the time since we last met in London in January last year. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone who's used our sites to help with family history research or for other reasons, which we're going to be exploring in this meeting. I'd particularly like to thank those who gave something back, for example, by suggesting a correction or supplying additional information or making a donation or supporting our work in another way. Secondly, I would like to thank those of you, most of you here, or those on live broadcast, who have volunteered. You have enabled FreeBMD to progress even closer to its original dateline of transcribing the entire indices to birth, marriage and death to 1983, and progressing with the double transcription, which improves the quality of that project. There are 330 billion records so far. The management team for the project have plans to provide access to still later data and for registrations in other settings, including consulates and the military, to be included. Making this technically possible, along with servicing and improving the existing site and tools is also the work of volunteers. You have enabled FreeUKGen to reach the halfway point of its original ambition to transcribe the Victorian censuses of Great Britain. There are now 33 million records available. A few weeks ago, we invited everyone to come and take a look at the first release of our new website, FreeUKGen 2. There's already one feature that's proving very popular, the ability to search across all censuses in the same search. And half of all the searches on the new site are like this. Slightly less popular is the nearby search feature. And this allows you to search in nearby places rather than just one, which can be useful in picking up people who were visiting friends nearby or in hospital or otherwise just somewhere near when family tradition or other sources suggest somebody should be somewhere, but they are not. You have helped take the development of FreeReg forwards and brought the total records transcribed to almost 40 million. When I say almost, I mean, if I'm reading the figures correctly, that the 40 million mark will either be met today, tomorrow, or sometime next week. FreeReg has seen an awful lot of behind-the-scenes work, largely thanks to the volunteer programmers and other technical volunteers, that has included updating to the latest versions of the operating software, and more importantly for the users, visibly important, seen the search speed and reliability vastly increased. Possibly invisible to most users and still a work in progress, we're improving the accessibility of the website. We had an audit by the Shaw Trust a year ago, which highlighted many issues for the people who have poor eyesight, which we already knew from user feedback, but also issues for those who use technology to access our websites, such as those who use technology to convert it to speech, and those that use speech commands to move the cursor and to click. Over the last year, we have welcomed a group of new volunteers who are helping us to publicise your work, raise income, understand the use of our websites, and with HR matters. We also now have a formal advisory board drawn from all of you, contributing invaluable advice to the trustees and myself from your unique perspectives. We shall be hearing shortly from two of those members of the advisory board, Nick Barrett and Humphrey Southall. I'm so sorry, I was just running my mind quickly through the cathedrals and had plumped on Lincoln. Finally, I would like to thank the other members of the support team. Denise, who is Engagement Coordinator, Rich, Technical Project Manager. Unfortunately, Vino, our website and database developer, and Helen, our bookkeeper, cannot be with us. However, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our new digitizer, Helen Bainbridge, who was only appointed on Wednesday but has made it here today. In other news, I and the trustees have spent a lot of time on matters which might appear to be purely administrivia, but which are necessary, including moving from an unincorporated charity to an incorporated charity, reviewing our security and our data protection. Our last meeting focused on open data, and we now have, thanks to invaluable feedback from our volunteers and others, a final version which existing and past transcribers will be invited to sign if they wish, and new transcribers for FreeUKGen are already being required to sign and soon will be in the other projects. We are developing parallel agreements for those who are making other contributions, such as the images and text which we are using in social media. It's been a very busy 18 months, and we hope you have seen developments visible, as well as perhaps appreciating some of the ones that are quieter and behind the scenes. We're rearranging the schedule slightly, and rather than me now talking about people who have been asking us for our open data, I'm going to hand over to Nick Barrett for his talk, and we plan to have mine again after tea. Thank you. Thank you all very much. introduce myself again.
Thanks, Pat. Hello, everybody, online and in the room. It's a really great pleasure to be invited back to talk to you and be asked to think a little bit about communities, because I've been working with different communities over the last 15 or so years, ever since I first got involved with genealogy. Up until that point, as some of you may know, my interest was largely around medieval history, particularly the data that you would find in the records of the Exchequer. So it was a bit of a jump moving into this field. However, I've spotted some really fundamental shifts, not just in how data is accessed, managed and demanded, but also the range of communities that are now benefiting from it. And I still come back to the fact that when I first started working on Who Do You Think You Are all those years ago, the primary source that we would be drawn towards was FreeBND and the emerging FreeReg and FreeCen datasets. And I think it's still the case that most people start there as well. There was a trust and a confidence in the quality of data that is being produced, and that has remained the bedrock of people's research techniques. And that's certainly where many seasoned genealogists and researchers point people towards when they first get started. So I think that's a really important point to recognise. This community is still really relevant and is setting standards in data quality, as well as the model of openness, which I'll come back to. But there has been a shift, and that's mainly through a couple of disruptions to the genealogical community. When many family histories started to form up over 40 years ago, they were social activities, people with a shared interest in one's roots, but it also came with a particular stereotype. You tended to be a much older person doing it when you were retired, that's so the story runs. And it wasn't proper history, it was a sort of self-indulgence. Navel gazing, as one of the first reviewers called Who Do You Think You Are, and anyone who is interested in genealogy. That has changed fundamentally. It is now a mainstream activity with mainstream large commercial entities making lots of money out of our passion for the past. But this has also led to a shift in some of the stakeholders, particularly amongst the non-commercial players. I'm thinking particularly of family history societies who are now struggling to make themselves visible. A lot of their early work was about transcription, and a lot of this was then commercialized through sales of CDs and books. Nowadays, they're feeding their data into the commercial market. But they've also noticed that people are now struggling to work out why they were going to be joining a family history society when there's a perfectly good U3A group down the road who can offer similar companionship and a passion for the past, but also a range of other activities. So there's been a marked shift away from people signing up to a family history society. And that goes hand in hand with the large commercial dataset market that we are encouraged to go to if we want to start our family history from scratch. So there's an issue there about visibility, both for the pre-existing family history groups, but also for many of the archives who are now being encouraged through the funding cuts post-2008 in the age of austerity to sell their data to find my past or ancestry. And this has challenged our ability, particularly in the FreeReg group, to gain access to our data that we need to provide a more open model. And this is now starting to come back to bite some of those archives involved. There was a case in the news only a couple of months ago in Northamptonshire. I don't know whether anyone picked up on this, but they had been proposing to expand their access to the reading rooms, which was a little bit disingenuous because they meant reducing free access and then introducing a pay-per-view service where you could go in but get charged £31.50 to look at public records. Now, this is because, yes, they need money, and I'm not suggesting anything otherwise. We know that many local authorities who provide access and manage this historic data are facing catastrophic cuts in their budgets because they're having to make choices about where funding is routed, and do we go and support fire services, police, teachers, etc., or do we keep archives open? So that's the challenge that we're now facing, keeping access to the public record open. And one route, naturally, is to partner up with a commercial entity, digitise the records, and then receive a revenue stream coming back in. We know this argument. But what we're now starting to see is that that revenue tail is dropping off because the data is much more commoditized. Lots of people have used the bulk of it, and now that is dwindling. But equally, we're also finding that the footfall is dropping off as well, because people traditionally used to go into those archives to look at the original material. And so it's sort of ended up the worst of both worlds. There's now no real justification for keeping the reading rooms open, nor subsidising them. That wasn't me. Maybe someone's trying to cut me off. So we end up with the situation in Northamptonshire where you're now being charged access to look at the public record. Now that has been rowed back from. That has been stopped for now. But it was very interesting that the resource generated by that proposed access fee was going to be put back into digitising more commercial records. So I just put that out there as a community that we need to think about. The archival world that holds our material, the state-generated, be that local or national record, that we rely on for access to our projects. So it's just a sort of cautionary note, both for transcription purposes and also research purposes. Many people still don't find the link between finding a family member online and then following up in a local archive. So we need to encourage that connection as well. So I'll just park that there. So we've got a change in the genealogical research community, more people working online, moving perhaps away from the Family History Society and having a more social activity at a U3A group. They're perhaps leaving the archives behind as well. So therefore, what are the communities that still look for and want access to this sort of data? And where are the new emerging community markets, if you'd like to put it that way? Well, there's a huge community in higher education. And that's where they too have struggled with this sense of openness. Open access publication for public purse-funded research is now standard. Various routes that you can choose, the gold route, which has the purest form of openness, and then a green route, which is part subsidised. So this is a current issue in higher education. But we're also finding, with digital humanities in particular leading the way, that there is a vast amount of interest in large data, so the big data markets, and linked data. And there are a couple of projects that have shown the potential for getting involved with these academic groups, provided we can provide the right level of access, this openness, again, that we've talked about. One example is the Digital Panopticon, which was run through a collaboration from various universities, including Liverpool and Sheffield. And what they wanted to do was to look at a range of data sets relating to transportation and connect up so that you can actually track someone's life. So it was very much about the public benefit. This was something everybody could use. That was the output, that was the impact of putting public money into creating these linked data sets. And it sounded a fantastic idea, and they're just starting to launch. But the problem was access to data. They quickly found that many of the public records, the criminal registers, the Hulk records, some of the trial indictment material that had traditionally been locked down in the National Archives were now only available by commercial license from the partners who had signed up to digitize and then transcribe those records. So the lack of openness, because of a pre-existing commercial model, had restricted a huge community from getting access to records that had been paid from by the public purse. So again, trying to find the right level of access is really important. And it did lead to a whole range of negotiations around whether there is a restricted access to certain data fields so that the commercial return was then made by the company that had taken the risk on digitizing those records. There's a whole range of other opportunities as well, and I'm thinking particularly around the birth and marriage death data sets. There have been a few discussions around looking at pandemics. And this is a bit of a leap, I admit, from what we first started talking about, but someone got very interested a few years ago around the spread of the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, and wanted to try and access some of the indexes to the death records to see whether the cause of death could then be extracted. So this was a large-scale digitization of the death certificates, and then see if they could start looking at the spread of the pandemic to see whether that would then have any sort of learning mechanism for current pandemic spreads. And of course, one of the things that they were first pointed towards were the indexes on FreeUKGen. So there is still a huge amount of potential for providing data, but also perhaps getting involved with some of the conversations around shaping these higher education models. So providing data is one opportunity, but there's also grant money available too. So many local groups are now becoming much more aligned to their local university as a route to gain credibility for some of their research, but also funding to come back into their groups so that they're not necessarily reliant on membership fees or transcription fees that have been sold on to some of the dataset companies. So it's a really interesting, very fertile community that is looking at big data sets and how they can also be linked around the social sciences and the humanities. This cascades down into primary and secondary education as well. And I've been lucky enough to work over the years with a number of projects who perhaps normally wouldn't have had access to the sort of research techniques that we as genealogists take for granted. One project was Making History, run by the actor Colin McFarlane. And he was astonished to find that when he looked at the history books, his sort of demographic was excluded from the official record. He came from an Afro-Caribbean background and was astonished to find that one of the party who first made it to the North Pole came from the Caribbean, or had Caribbean background. So he wanted to find out more about his roots. And every time he tried to search, he came up with a blog. And through that process of discovery, he wanted to give people the opportunity to explore their stories. So he worked in a couple of sample areas. One was in London, in some of the Hackney schools, and another one in Lincoln. And the idea was to give different age groups the opportunity to explore their family roots, but with a range of different outcomes. So a lot of it was about storytelling, and it was about including a different range. I'm moving away in case that thing goes up. Including a range of different techniques. So a lot of it was about traditional genealogical material. So how far back can we go? And we pointed them towards FreeReg, FreeSend, FreeBMD, so that they could at least get started. But other groups, particularly around Hackney, where there were different ethnic backgrounds, different migrant stories, different languages, this simply was not possible. So we had a very sort of soft storytelling approach. Tell us stories from your parents, your grandparents. What is the story that brings you here? And then within a class environment, just swap those stories so people got a better sense of where they'd come from. So it was more about journey storytelling. And we were able then to match the two sample groups together and found some incredible stories that just linked up. So again, it's sort of linkage, but it's at a much lower level. And this was a community that you could have said, we're going to do a genealogy project too, would have just, no, not doing that. All sorts of ethical issues and source problems. But actually, by doing it on a narrative storytelling level, but still using online data, it proved fascinating. We had one group in Hackney who, again, had come from an Afro-Caribbean background, and they'd managed to track back by connecting up with family who had remained in the Caribbean, family had originally come over in the 1960s and 70s. So we went back and they talked to them, and they got back into the 19th century, where perhaps unsurprisingly, they found out that they had come from a particular plantation, and then went further back and found that they had previously, in fact, their ancestors had been from a slave community. So that allowed them to just ponder and think what that must have been like and put their family into a wider context. At the same time, we looked at the Lincoln group, and one particular family found that they had also got Caribbean roots, but they were plantation owners. And it turned out that they had once owned the same plantation where the other group's family had been slaves. So this was one of those rare, incredible moments of chance discovery. And we thought, okay, well, let's see if we can do something with this. And it was very carefully mediated, and we got permissions from everyone, but we brought the two families together to talk about this sort of experience. And it was really quite incredible what reaction that got. And there was a real empathy and an interest in each other's stories without any of the political sensitivities around slavery. But it got them thinking about it. It got them really touching base with what that must have been. And you can say, okay, well, that's social history, but that's my point. This is a new audience. This is a new community that perhaps would never have thought of doing genealogy, but were introduced to it through online connectivity and then offline connectivity, bringing them together. So it's really opened up the potential for schools to access new data and to be able to work collaboratively across the country. So it was a really soft way of bringing stories in. This also played out at higher age groups as well. And we worked with another group who were going to choose their A-levels. And they tended to be the sort who weren't that academic. They weren't interested necessarily in going on to do a degree. And there was one family in particular who had no idea that he might have any sort of Irish ancestry because his family just simply didn't talk about him. His name was Liam, which is quite a sort of Irish name, and so we were a bit surprised at that. But the story was, when he started talking to his dad, that his granddad had been working in a bar in Belfast in the 1970s, and he said goodbye to one of his friends as he was leaving, who was then shot in the street that night. So we saw that and thought, this is really dangerous. I'm not going to put up with this. So he picked up all of his belongings. He left with his wife and his son, Liam's father, and then just drove and left Ireland, got the ferry, went across, went to Liverpool, and kept on driving, and eventually settled in Lincoln. And that's where he made his base and just left the troubles and all the stories behind. Now, we had awakened an interest in Liam, in his roots. And he wanted to start to investigate this in a bit more detail. And so we sat down and interviewed his father. And then one of the reasons we wanted to do this project was that we were encouraging our students to make films about their experiences. And he made this film where he persuaded his father to go back to Belfast. And he filmed and recorded all of these things. And he overlaid it with news clips of the Troubles, with traditional music, and some of the genealogical results of his search. And as part of the wrap-up of the project, we showed these films at the BFI. So it was a room full of adults and students and historians and professionals. We had various members of the genealogical commercial community looking at the films. And once we'd screened Liam's film, we just had sort of everyone sort of sobbing quietly. I've never seen an audience so moved by a piece of film. It really transported you back to what it must have been like, the fear, the terror, the concerns at the time. It was an amazing experience. So again, it was a new community that we brought in and shown that an element of genealogy with a large element of storytelling can really affect people. And as a result, Declan then really engaged with his studies. He then went to university and he's doing history and media studies. So it transformed his life at a particular level. Now we found this is playing out, this sort of online search for real-time experience, and the phenomenon of ancestral tourism is absolutely fundamentally based on being able to track where your ancestors have come from. And this is bringing people back into the British Isles from around the world. So there is a clear economic reason for putting open data, accessible data online. And this has been grasped particularly in Ireland. There's a very strong national story of exodus, of diaspora, particularly in the middle of the 19th century with the potato famine and large numbers of people, first of all, being displaced from the land into the cities. Some starved, others then died of terrible disease because of the lack of sanitation, and many more fleeing to a new life, either in England or going across the Atlantic into America. And you can see the population stats of Ireland from its high, dipping dramatically and never really recovering. It still hasn't recovered the levels that we had in the country from the 1840s and 50s. What we are seeing now is that there is an increase in people coming back. And that's driven by a couple of things. Firstly, the compelling story. So there is a national narrative. The wickedness of the English landlords and the downtrodden Irish heading overseas. So that's a huge generalization, but it's a strong narrative to come back, to come and reclaim the lost land. But that's made possible because a lot more Irish records have been made available by the Irish government for free, the 1901 and 1911 census in partnership with Canada. So this was freely accessible data with a clear reason to bring people back so they would spend money in the local economy, in the hotels, on the golf courses, but also on ancestral trails around the country. So the data is driving a huge economic community of migrants coming back in, the ancestral tourists. You can even buy a certificate of Irishness online. which many people are now doing, so they can get an EU passport post-Brexit, so I'm told. So there's another community I never thought I'd be talking about 15 months ago. But the same applies in Scotland. They estimated there was a 50 million diaspora community around the world who could trace Scottish roots back to the mid-19th century, if not earlier, around to about the time of the Highland clearances in the late 18th. And so we've had 2 homecoming events. There was, a few years ago, a real drive to bring people back. Visit Scotland hired an ancestral tourism officer. This also coincided, I believe, with the referendum vote. Whether or not the 2 things are linked, you come back, you get a vote, I don't know, I think not. It also coincided with the Battle of Bannockburn. There's a common theme around a national narrative appearing. Anyway, this was a huge initiative, They worked out that it would probably add between 5 and 6 billion to the Scottish economy over the 2-3 year period when it was took place and then tailed off. People coming to sample the local whiskies, ancestral trails set up around the country. The archives welcoming people in because they could now suddenly reach them through other routes. So we know all about Scotland's people and the way that they have Quran, all the data together, so that it's a one-stop shop for Scottish genealogy. And that was at the heart of bringing people back in during that period. So 2009, 2014, a big push on back to your roots, back to the local community on the national ticket. But all driven by access to data to prove that connectivity. So it wasn't necessarily open data, but it was data used for a particular socio-economic impact. That's a really important thing. In England, we're finding a slightly different approach. There are ancestral tourism networks, but they're very patchy. They are driven much more by a regional identity. So Northamptonshire, Nottinghamshire are part of an East Midlands group. But we are finding that lots of local funding, mainly through HLF, is going into supporting a grassroots approach that uses data sets to give people access to identity and then help them with particular issues. So there's a societal community that we now need to perhaps have a look at. A couple of examples. Looking back quickly into Scotland, there was a prison in Scotland, there's lots of prisons in Scotland, in Stirling, I meant to say, and they took a very novel approach to preparing prisoners to then go back into community. And as you'd expect, there were vocational courses giving people the skills to go out and then re-engage and get jobs. But there was also a course run on genealogy. And the idea behind this is that it would give people the chance to do some research, so it's honing one's research skills, but also to find ancestors that you wanted to aspire to. You were inspired by their lives, you wanted to understand about decisions, and perhaps turn your life around and make positive decisions. And when you compared the reoffending rates for those who had and had not been on this course, it was quite startling. Virtually no one who'd done this genealogical approach went on to reoffend compared to other groups who'd just done a pure vocational approach. There was this real sort of reboot of your life. This is my chance to put the past behind me. This is the sort of career I want because that seems to be a family trait. This is the person I want to emulate because they also made a success of their lives. So there was a deep-rooted approach to bringing people into community and then responding to it. And that's been used for other groups as well, other communities that perhaps are forgotten about. There was a wonderful project in Kent that looked at a group of people who had physical and mental disabilities, but were often therefore assigned identities by others according to how they looked or what they were doing. And the group we worked with were given access to genealogical tools, including access to FreeUKGen, but also physical objects. It was called Touching the Past. And they were able to then self-define their identity through the research and what they found. So many, again, discovered that their ancestors had been artists, so they wanted to have a go at that. And it was really wonderful to see them become confident and expressive about, well, this is who I am, because this is what I found out. So that sort of light touch approach really works. Now, there's one case study before I sort of draw towards a conclusion that I want to talk about where many of these elements have come together, and it's on the Isle of Wight, the Ryde Social Heritage Group. Now, this is a community who had found that their local cemetery was being vandalised on a regular basis by the local youths, who were bored, had nowhere to go, thought it was fun to kick down the gravestones or scrawl upon them. And so a group got together and were given a small chunk of money so that they could then transcribe those records and upload them themselves. This is about 10, 12 years ago. So this is after we started to find ancestry and what becomes Find My Past, getting interested in transcribed data sets. But the key thing there is that they hung on to their data, but they published it openly online so that anyone could then go in and have a look and find out where their ancestor was buried. And they noticed an extraordinary thing happening. After the data set had gone up, many of the local hotels have been contacting people, often out of peak season, saying, oh, can I just book a night? I want to go visit the graveyard. So people from around the world were finding this data and then using it on an ancestral tourism ticket to come in and pay their respects. So there was an immediate uplift in bookings and the local economy. So the council took notice and gave them a much larger grant, this time £60,000, to start to renovate one of the 2 chapels in the graveyard. And as a result, they were given that as a space where they could start to build a community and local archive and hold drop-in sessions for people who wanted to join the volunteer group. And as a result, they started to capture oral history. They went round into some of the local nursing homes and recorded some of the older residents. But they also started to connect with the schools so that they could have this cross-generational learning opportunity. This proved so popular that they were given the other chapel, and that was turned into a graveyard classroom, where the schools were first encouraged and then required to hold lessons across the curriculum. So there was history, focusing on local history, light touch genealogy, but also things such as nature trails around the graveyard. There was one particular fallen gravestone that was home to a family of slow ones underneath, and they would habitually be lifted up and the poor creature would slither off, but children loved it. And they could then do art classes, looking at some of the more ornate carvings and sculptures on the headstones and in some of the mausolea. And they would do things such as literacy, numeracy, they would film things, and they would then get involved with the capture of more data. So it became this virtuous circle. And as a result, education levels started to improve. Criminality in the graveyard almost dropped off completely. Volunteers started to flood to the group, so that 10 years later, it won a Community Archive Heritage Group of Archive of the Year award as an exemplar of how to reboot a situation where the community was damaging itself, and suddenly it was so much better. But it was driven by that data, by putting that data online and keeping hold of it, but making it open. And it was a really interesting model, because it flew in the face of the existing wisdom of sell it to ancestry and get some money in. So by hanging on to it, it had a huge benefit. And we're now starting to see the benefit of data and research starting to expand out. The thing there was that it was about volunteers taking an interest in their community, connecting up with older members. And we're now beginning to see the emergence of evidence that the more research and transcription and genealogy you do, the less likely you are to fall foul of things such as dementia. Now, there is a link that is being investigated. We need to find more evidence, obviously, but there seems to be this sense that the more you chronicle your life and those of others, the more you are then in tune with your personal timeline. But it's more about the skill that actually doing this could help prolong and extend the value of your life. So, bringing those various strands together, just having a look at the situation moving forward. Well, we've had the warning from Northamptonshire. We've got best practice from RIDE. We've seen how individuals can benefit from a localized approach. And we've seen that data underpins all of this. But we do need to work with other communities as well. And nowhere is this at its strongest than in the Southwest. Plymouth faced a failing local archive. It was about to be closed. The records would be dispersed, and there was an outcry. And over a number of years, 5, 6, 7 years, local groups have come together and shown the benefit of working together to save their archive, but also support it by providing volunteer opportunities, and also start work on transcribing material. and they now have a multi-million-pound new heritage centre as a reward. But one of the key fundamental points is that it is a home for many of these projects. It's a physical base. So effectively, again, it's this virtuous circle. Given the numbers of volunteers involved in our community and across the country, this I believe to be the future, and why it's so important that we do get this open model right. Our community is obviously driven by what we do and what we're interested in. But what I hopefully have shown is the potential to link into many of these other communities, this patchwork, higher education, archive, schools, community groups, charities, and other projects can actually benefit all far more than just doing it individually. So hopefully that will tee up some discussion, and I'll hand over to our next speaker unless we're going to a break.
I think it's Pat now, and then we're going to break in about half an hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just hold on a moment, I've decided I'm going to change the point size. This is what happens when you try a new app and it doesn't let you change the point size on one document but does on another. So please forgive me if I squinted this. Also, my apologies again to Humphrey Southall for getting his name, but at least I remembered half of it. I didn't remember to tell you my name. I'm Pat Reynolds. I'm the Executive Director of Free UK Genealogy, and apologies again for not saying that at the outset. I switched around the order because talking to Nick beforehand, it occurred to me that it made more sense for, first of all, Nick to talk about the big picture, what's going on in the big world of genealogy, before I brought it down to what's happening in Free UK Genealogy from the perspective of, over the last 2 years, I've been getting requests for people who found out that we're becoming open data, that we will have data to share, and saying, when's it going to be ready? What can I have? And I've been saying, it's not there yet, but I'll write your name down and all about you, and I'll get back to you. And this point in our history seems like a really good one to actually review what I've got so far. They're quite diverse. Some of them, when I mention them, you'll think, well, yes, that was what Nick was talking about. One of them's really odd. Some of them are a bit unexpected. It's not surprising that we've got a small number of requests which have come from family history websites, and all of them are adding something else to what we are doing. I should say that, stay bright, thank you. I should say that I've been asking people if I can have permission to talk about what they want to do. Obviously, some of them are commercial in confidence, some of them are academic in confidence, so I will be using just a few examples. And one example of a family history website that would like to have our data is one called Ancient Faces, which encourages people to add pictures of people to existing records and tie the existing records through people entered family trees. And at the moment, the war graves data set seems to be all they have from the UK. So naturally, our data would enrich their site a great deal. It's a free-to-use site, and like us, they keep the servers spinning by selling advertising on that site. Somewhat similar to these are public serving historical data agglomeration sites. The Panopticon of Justice site that was mentioned serves an academic community, but also a public community. It brings together data from a wide range of sources and serves it in a single place. In the case of Panopticon, it's data that really relates to that one historical movement of an individual through transportation. Others of them are focused largely on localities. They work on the basis that if you're interested in 38 the High Street, Godalming, you really aren't bothered whether what you find out when you type in 38 the High Street, Godalming is the Free Sen data, whether it's the parish register that mentions somebody living at 38 the High Street because it was the vicarage. You'd quite like to see pictures of it through time that might be in postcard collections, for example, but it's not really interesting to you whether those postcards are held by the local museum, a county museum, the local archive, a special archive group. You just want to get to the pictures. And these sites, rather than searching a single institution's databases, or sometimes no databases at all in the case of some institutions, or only present narratives of notable families, or the WI, or the pubs, or the schools and so on, the agglomeration sites pull from different institutions, and some of these have their own transcription programs. And of these, we've been in contact with a commercial company that builds such sites and wants to be able to talk to its clients about saying, why not bring in data from Free UK Genealogy and serve it alongside everything else that you're serving about 38 the High Street? They're often map-based, and there's always a great depth of local knowledge alongside the records of archaeological finds, the postcards and such like. And these are narratives which come from the contributing organisations, but sometimes also they're sourced from the general public. Similar to that, we've had a request in from openarch.nl, which is basically an agglomeration of everything in archives in the Netherlands as open data. And they want to add our data to what they've got from the Dutch archives for obvious reasons. People from the Netherlands moved here, people from here moved to the Netherlands, and people want to trace those passages. I was going to speak here about Humphrey's Past Place project, but I'm going to leave that to the end and ask him to speak about it in detail. Humphrey's project is a public-facing project, but he's also an academic, and the largest group of requests I've got in are from people associated with universities and independent scholars. Oliver Duke-Williams, for example, who's also on our advisory committee, is interested in the kind of analyses that are run on more modern censuses, but running them on the Victorian ones when those analyses weren't done. And he's already undertaken some pilot work that is showing the possibilities that are available from the Cornwall data. Another academic wants to investigate how, well not exactly how, but when and where and with what father-son transmission of craft, trade or professional standing passes. And that's in the marriage records, because you get told the groom's profession or trade and the father's. So you can trace in a certain place at a certain time, the blacksmith's son was a blacksmith or not. And that's why he wants access to the data from FreeUKGen, particularly the marriage data. Some of them want to use our data in rather strange ways, such as one man who has spoken to me quite a lot about machine learning. And I think it's just interesting data for finding out how machines learn and whether they can learn from our data. I'm a bit sad that I haven't had yet any requests for our use of our data for genetic medical research. 2 years ago, I was on the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is in the South Atlantic and has the great good fortune to have only about 200 inhabitants, most of whom were descended from a very, very small number of families. And as a result, their genetic histories are known personally to the inhabitants now. Everybody can trace where they came from because it only goes back 200 years and it's very small and it doesn't get very genetically mixed, which means if you want to do genetic medical research into asthma, for example, because everybody on the island is asthmatic as far as I could hear. Church services were interesting. It was just about because as a visitor you're a guest and you go to all the church services. It's much easier to follow ones in the Anglican Church because of my Anglican upbringing than the Catholic Church, because you can't actually hear an awful lot that's being said because of the coughing. But this having this genetic data from DNA and being able to use it on a population where you have the family history is really, really useful. And another example that I really love is some work that's been done in Sweden on a little tiny village community in a remote valley where in the early 20th century the crops failed and because of the remoteness people starved. And because of the way Swedish genealogy works, they could trace descendants of this community. And they found that the descendants of this community were more likely to be type 1 diabetic than the general Swedish population. And then another group of scientists thought, oh, that looks quite odd. Well, where can we find another group of people who've been starved, where we've got good genealogical information? And they thought, oh, I know. Netherlands at the end of the Second World War. Very tight, timed starvation period there. What they found out was that it actually matters what gender the baby, it actually ties in to babies who are in the womb at the time of starvation and the gender and the point in development. So they're getting some fascinating medical research out because of something which fortunately doesn't happen very much in this country of periods of starvation, but does need that ability to trace descendants. And I'm sure that once we get a larger data pool known to medical researchers, they will be able to use it to find out some really interesting stuff related to inherited conditions. I mentioned, closely related to those academic requests are those from local historians. For example, we have one request from somebody who might be a sole author or might be representing a local history group or just an individual curious about the history of his town, but he wants all our data from that town so that he can write a history. The one oddity that I haven't been able to categorise, and I was hoping that Nick's talk would allow me to slot them into a category, is somebody who wants forenames, doesn't want surnames, doesn't want place, just wants the forenames. And this is what keeps me awake at night, trying to work out. I mean, I must admit, I haven't had time to, I've gone back to him, but he hasn't responded yet as to why. The only thing I can come up with is that he runs a baby name website and wants to pick up some that he hasn't had before. I am recording a number of things about each request that comes in. because we need to prioritise who gets this data, and if there is a cost involved in getting this data, who bears that cost. So one of the things I record is who benefits. And is that benefit just to genealogists? Then will the results be open? Not just our data, but the enhancements that they provide, the sets they bring together. Will they be free to search and to manipulate? And for an academic, that means making sure, or requesting, that the resulting papers are open rather than put behind a paywall. Depending on what data is wanted and whether it is wanted as a once-off data set in standard format or something bespoke, or whether they want to regularly update their copy so that they hold the latest version, which can be done automatically, but that will mean we will have to buy extra servers. The cost to us of providing that data will be different. We will need to recharge costs where the purpose does not meet our charitable aims, and assess whether those that do meet our aims are the highest priority for our resources, the best way of spending the resources we have, whether that's monetary or volunteer time. It's going to be really interesting seeing what happens over the next few years. But one thing I'm sure of, wherever our data is used, the use will be controlled by license, and people will be able to come back to our original records to check for the quality. But it will be used. It will be available to communities to use, and communities who are different from those we already serve, and those that we could never hope to reach without sharing. Thank you. I should say that rather than having the traditional questions at the end of each bit, we're going to have a panel after tea. I'd now like to hand over to Humphrey for him to talk about the Past Place project.
Right, thanks. Got the same problem of trying to look at a rather hurriedly written note. Firstly, I'm not a family historian, I'm a historical geographer, but I build websites. And that means we built the Vision of Britain website, which provides very systematic information, not just about places in a general way, but about legally defined areas, including all the parishes, all the registration districts in Britain. That's not currently, or at least the core of it isn't currently open data, partly because a lot of the data belongs to the Royal Historical Society, and I've been working with Richard Light to try to open that up. Another bit of the data that isn't open, the actual digital boundaries, and we have a problem there. They belong to us, but they are not simply a source of PIN money, they are our main source of income, licensing them, which means we can't make them completely open, but we can make open point coordinates. So that's very quickly Vision of Britain. Secondly, Old Maps Online, which I'll say nothing much about beyond the fact it's hopefully a really friendly, easy way of finding maps that cover particular places in lots of different online map collections. Thirdly, and this is a bit more relevant here, the GB 1900 project. This is another current volunteer project, and what we're trying to do is computerize all the place names, and in fact all the text, on 6-inch to the mile maps of the whole of Great Britain around 1900. We currently have 2.6 million names transcribed. We have every expectation of finishing that project by Christmas. It'll be the most detailed gazetteer of Britain ever created, and it'll definitely be open data. And it lists every farm by name and so on, which we think will be of a lot of benefit. And so we've also got about 1,200 volunteers signed up. Now, that leads me on to Past Place. There kind of is a Past Place website at the moment, but frankly, it's a bit embarrassing. At best, it's a prototype. It's mainly now the name of an application we're starting to work on to the Heritage Lottery Fund. And if it's successful, it would completely replace both Vision of Britain and GB 1900. It would be a site that contained information about all the places in the UK, one aspect is we propose to extend to Ireland as part of this. It would be extensible by its users. We want to build on GB 1900, and one aspect, we've got a lot of our own volunteers who want to do more stuff. We've had to tell them we're about to run out of stuff for them to do. But if we're going to get, it's very hard to see where we can get funding for this other than the Heritage Lottery Fund. And we have a massive problem demonstrating it, quote, benefits, quote, people and communities. At the moment, I've got a meeting with them on Monday. The guy I'm talking to keeps trying to tell me to make it a project about Portsmouth. They don't really believe in the concept of a community that's anything other than based in a single place. We need to build, technically, a piece of geospatial infrastructure, an online system, a website that understands how to work with coordinates. That's technically complex. It's inevitably a bit expensive. To justify that cost, it needs to cover the whole country. But we have a problem explaining how it will benefit anything not in a particular place. We need to have organisations on board, and touch wood, that will include Free UK Genealogy. Very much a matter of discussion. We certainly aren't, and a lot of this is about making the information we hold about things like parishes and registration districts clearly extensible through expert volunteers working on it. This is definitely not a request for funding from Free UK Genealogy. If this goes forward, we'd be looking for a couple of signatures, definitely indicating involvement. We'd be looking for a representative on a steering group, and possibly some technically expert people as well, because we need it to be a system that is extensible by its users, and not just in the way that GB 1900 is. Touch wood, that's what, and I'd be very happy to talk about this insofar as there is time, for example, over tea. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Tea will be coming in at 2:30, so just a couple of minutes.
Okay, in which case, I'd like to thank all our speakers this afternoon, and particularly Denise for organising everybody in here. We will be now breaking for tea. Another apology from me, I forgot to get the gluten-free biscuits out of my bag. So for those of you who, like me, don't eat gluten, we have got some biscuits and cake for you at the back. We'll be reconvening at
2:45.
2:45. Thank you.